A black woman, wrongfully arrested by a racist cop, refuses to back down. In a fight against prejudice and abuse of power, her courage exposes the dark reality of racism in law enforcement. This story of injustice and resilience will leave you shocked and inspired, as one woman's stand against discrimination sparks a powerful call for change. The sun had just begun to set over the small, bustling city of Fairview. The evening air was crisp, and the streets were alive with people heading home after a long day. Among them was Angela Wright, a confident and determined black woman in her late 30s, returning from an exhausting day at her job as a social worker. Dressed in professional attire and carrying her briefcase, Angela walked with purpose, her mind occupied by the cases she was working on to support underprivileged families. Angela stopped at a local convenience store to pick up a few groceries. Inside, she exchanged polite greetings with the cashier, a young woman who recognized Angela from her regular visits. As Angela browsed the aisles, she noticed the eyes of a uniformed police officer lingering on her. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and had a stern, almost menacing look on his face. His badge read, Officer Bradley. Angela felt the weight of his gaze but tried to brush it off. Stay calm, she thought to herself. It wasn't the first time she'd encountered suspicion simply for existing in her own skin. As Angela paid for her items and exited the store, Officer Bradley followed her outside. He called out sharply, "Excuse me, ma'am. I need to ask you a few questions." Angela stopped, turning to face him with a calm but cautious expression. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. Bradley's eyes narrowed. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area. Mind if I see what's in your bag?" Angela's heart sank. She had done nothing wrong, and this wasn't the first time she had been unfairly targeted. "I've just come from work and picked up some groceries," she replied firmly. "I don't think that's suspicious." But Bradley wasn't satisfied. "Let me see your ID," he demanded, his tone growing harsher. A small crowd began to gather, sensing the tension. Angela felt a wave of frustration and anger rising within her, but she kept her composure. "Officer, with all due respect, I don't believe I've done anything that warrants this kind of treatment." Bradley's face hardened. "Are you refusing to comply? Because if you are, that's obstruction." Angela hesitated for a moment, weighing her options. She knew she had every right to refuse, but she also knew how quickly situations like this could escalate. Reluctantly, she handed over her ID, her hands trembling slightly. As Bradley scrutinized her ID, a man in the crowd began recording the interaction on his phone. "This is ridiculous," the man muttered loudly. "She's just walking home, for crying out loud." Bradley glared at the man but said nothing. He handed Angela's ID back, but instead of letting her go, he stepped closer. "Empty your bag," he ordered. Angela's patience snapped. "No, officer. I'm not going to stand here and be treated like a criminal for no reason." Bradley's face turned red with anger. "That's it," he barked. Before Angela could react, he grabbed her arm roughly, attempting to cuff her. The crowd gasped, and the man recording shouted, "This is wrong. She didn't do anything." Angela felt the cold metal of the handcuffs clamp around her wrist. Tears of anger and humiliation welled up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. As Bradley led her toward his patrol car, she noticed the faces of the bystanders, some shocked, some furious, and others looking away, as if they couldn't bear to witness the injustice. At that moment, Angela made a silent promise to herself. She wouldn't let this go. She would fight back, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been wronged by prejudice and abuse of power. Angela sat in the back of the police car, her mind racing as she tried to process what had just happened. The reality of being arrested for doing nothing wrong hit her hard, but she refused to let herself feel defeated. She was no stranger to injustice. As a social worker, she had seen firsthand how systemic biases and prejudices could destroy lives. But now, it wasn't someone else's story, it was hers. The patrol car arrived at the station, and Officer Bradley roughly pulled her out, drawing more attention from onlookers outside. Angela noticed their glances, a mixture of curiosity, pity, and outrage. Inside, Bradley continued to act with hostility, barking orders, and treating Angela as if she were a dangerous criminal. The arresting officer's demeanor only fueled her resolve. As she was processed and led to a holding cell, Angela spotted another officer watching the scene from a distance. The name on his badge read, Sergeant Lopez. Unlike Bradley, Lopez seemed uneasy, his brows furrowed as he observed the events unfold. Angela made a mental note of his reaction, wondering if he might become an ally. Sitting alone in the cold, grey cell, Angela thought about what she needed to do next. She had the number of a lawyer friend, Diana Hill, who was passionate about civil rights. Angela knew that Diana wouldn't just represent her, she'd fight tooth and nail to ensure justice was served. Meanwhile, the video of Angela's arrest, recorded by the bystander, was already gaining traction on social media. The clip, showing Bradley aggressively handcuffing her while bystanders protested, quickly went viral. People were outraged, flooding the comments with messages of support for Angela and calls for accountability. One particular comment caught the attention of many. This isn't just about Angela. It's about every black person who's been treated like this. Enough is enough. The video became a rallying point for conversations about racial profiling and police misconduct. The next morning, Angela's lawyer, Diana, arrived at the station. With her sharp suit and commanding presence, Diana immediately demanded to see her client. Bradley's smug demeanor faltered when Diana entered the room. "You have no grounds to hold her," Diana said firmly. "This is blatant racial profiling, and you'll be hearing from us." Bradley scoffed, but before he could respond, Sergeant Lopez stepped in. "Officer Bradley," Lopez said, his tone measured but firm. "We need to review the situation. There's already a lot of public attention on this case." Bradley looked annoyed, but reluctantly agreed to release Angela on bail. As she walked out of the station with Diana by her side, Angela felt a sense of relief, but also a burning desire to hold Bradley accountable. Outside, a small group of supporters had gathered, holding signs that read, "Justice for Angela" and "Stop Racial Profiling." Angela was deeply moved by their presence. One of the supporters approached her and said, "You're not alone in this fight. We're with you." Angela smiled, her resolve strengthening. "Thank you," she said. "This isn't just my fight, it's ours." Back at home, Angela and Diana strategized their next steps. "We're not just going to file a complaint," Diana said. "We're going to make this a case that exposes the systemic issues behind what happened to you." Angela nodded. "I'm ready," she said. "Let's make sure no one else has to go through this." By the end of the day, Angela's story had become headline news. The video had been shared millions of times, sparking protests and discussions across the country. Angela knew this was only the beginning of a long battle, but she was determined to see it through. As Angela's story gained national attention, the public outrage intensified. News outlets covered the viral video, interviewing witnesses and discussing the larger issue of racial profiling. Angela became a symbol of strength and resilience, though she hadn't asked for the spotlight. Despite the overwhelming support, she faced her share of challenges. Online trolls and defenders of the police flooded her social media with hateful comments, trying to discredit her character. But Angela stayed focused on her mission: justice. Meanwhile, Diana worked tirelessly to prepare Angela's case. She gathered evidence, interviewed witnesses, and connected with civil rights organizations willing to provide support. "This isn't just about you, Angela," Diana reminded her during one of their meetings. "This is about changing the system that allows this kind of abuse to happen." Angela nodded. "I understand that, but I also want Officer Bradley to face the consequences of his actions. People like him need to know they can't treat others this way and get away with it." Back at the police station, tensions were rising. Sergeant Lopez had seen enough to know that Bradley's actions were out of line. He reviewed the department's body camera footage and found clear evidence that Angela had done nothing wrong. The footage corroborated the bystander's video, showing Bradley escalating the situation unnecessarily. Lopez decided to speak up. In a meeting with his superiors, He presented the evidence. "This isn't just about one officer," he said. "This is about the culture in our department. If we don't address it, we're complicit." The room fell silent. Some officers nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably. The chief, a stern but fair man named Chief Davis, leaned forward. "I'll review the footage myself," he said. "But if what you're saying is true, there will be consequences." As Diana filed a formal lawsuit against Officer Bradley and the police department, Angela began receiving invitations to speak at community events and rallies. At one such event, she stood before a crowd of hundreds, holding a microphone. Her voice was steady, but filled with emotion. "I didn't ask to be put in this position," Angela began. "But now that I'm here, I won't stay silent. What happened to me is just one example of what so many people in our community face every day. It's time for change." The crowd erupted in applause, chanting, "Justice for Angela." Her words resonated deeply, and her message spread far beyond the event. Angela's courage inspired others to share their own stories of injustice, creating a wave of solidarity and action. As the case moved forward, Officer Bradley's past actions came under scrutiny. It turned out that Angela wasn't the first person to accuse him of misconduct. Several other individuals came forward, sharing similar experiences of being unfairly targeted and mistreated. Diana wasted no time incorporating this into their case, building a damning profile of Bradley's behavior. Angela felt a mix of anger and determination. "This is exactly why we can't let this slide," she told Diana. "If we don't hold him accountable, he'll keep doing this to other people." Diana agreed. "We're going to make sure he can't hide behind his badge anymore." At the same time, Chief Davis publicly announced an internal investigation into Bradley's conduct. The move was unprecedented for the department, which had often resisted admitting fault. Community leaders praised the decision, though many remained skeptical about whether real change would follow. Angela watched the news coverage with a heavy heart. "It's a start," she said to Diana, "but it's not enough. We need to make sure this doesn't just fade away once the headlines move on." Diana placed a reassuring hand on Angela's shoulder. "We won't let that happen. This case is bigger than any one of us." The trial date approached, and tensions were at an all-time high. Angela prepared herself mentally for the courtroom, knowing the weight of the case extended far beyond her personal experience. Diana worked late nights, crafting an airtight argument. The evidence was clear. The bystanders' video, the body cam footage, and the testimonies of others who had faced similar treatment from Officer Bradley painted a damning picture of racial profiling and abuse of power. The courtroom was packed on the day of the trial. Media outlets filled the seats, alongside community members who had come to support Angela. She sat beside Diana, her heart pounding as the judge called the session to order. Across the room, Officer Bradley sat with his lawyer, his demeanor smug and defiant. Diana began her opening statement with a powerful declaration. "This case isn't just about my client, Angela Wright. It's about a system that has allowed unchecked bias and misconduct to flourish. It's about accountability, justice, and the basic rights that every citizen is entitled to." Her words set the tone for the trial. Diana presented the body cam footage, showing how Bradley had escalated the situation without cause. She called on witnesses, including the man who had recorded the viral video, to testify about what they saw that day. When it was Angela's turn to take the stand, she spoke with quiet strength. "I've spent my career helping others fight against injustice," she said. "But I never thought I'd have to fight it in such a personal way. What happened to me that day was humiliating, but I refused to let it define me. I'm here because no one else should have to go through what I did." The defense tried to argue that Bradley was acting within his authority, but their claims crumbled under the weight of the evidence. Diana cross-examined Bradley, forcing him to admit inconsistencies in his story. When pressed about why he had targeted Angela, his answers grew defensive and evasive. As the trial continued, more people came forward to testify about their own experiences with racial profiling. Their stories added to the growing narrative of systemic issues within the department. making it impossible for the jury to ignore the pattern. Outside the courtroom, the community's support for Angela continued to grow. Vigils, marches, and rallies were held, with signs reading, "Justice for Angela" and "End Racial Profiling." Activists and civil rights leaders used her case as a rallying cry for broader reform. Angela attended many of these events, speaking passionately about the need for systemic change. "This isn't just about one bad officer," she told a crowd of supporters. "It's about a system that allows prejudice to go unchecked. But together, we can demand better. We can demand accountability." The case reached its climax when Diana called Sergeant Lopez to the stand. Lopez testified about the department's internal review of Bradley's actions and the troubling pattern it revealed. "We have a responsibility to uphold the law, not abuse it," Lopez said. His testimony was a turning point, reinforcing the credibility of Angela's case and highlighting the need for change within the police department. As closing arguments began, Diana delivered a passionate plea to the jury. "This case is about more than Angela Wright. It's about standing up to injustice wherever it exists. Today, you have the power to send a message that prejudice and abuse of power will not be tolerated." The jury deliberated for hours, the tension in the courtroom palpable as everyone waited for the verdict. When the jury finally returned, Angela held her breath. The courtroom was silent as the jury foreperson stood to deliver the verdict. Angela's heart raced, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Diana sat beside her, calm but focused, a quiet confidence radiating from her. "We find the defendant, Officer Bradley, guilty of misconduct and abuse of power," the foreperson announced. A collective gasp filled the room, followed by murmurs of approval from Angela's supporters. Tears welled up in Angela's eyes as the weight of the verdict sank in. Justice had been served, but this was more than a personal victory. It was a moment of reckoning for the systemic issues the case had exposed. The judge addressed the courtroom, acknowledging the broader implications of the trial. "This case has brought to light serious concerns about accountability and equality in law enforcement," the judge stated. "It is my hope that this serves as a reminder that no one is above the law and that we must strive for a justice system that treats all individuals with fairness and dignity." Officer Bradley was visibly shaken as he was led away, his once confident demeanor replaced by anger and disbelief. For Angela, the sight was bittersweet. While she was relieved to see him face consequences, she knew the real work was just beginning. Outside the courthouse, Angela was met with cheers from a large crowd of supporters. Signs reading, "Justice for Angela" and "End Racism Now" waved in the air as people chanted her name. She stepped to a microphone, flanked by Diana and other activists who had supported her throughout the ordeal. "This victory isn't just mine, it's ours," Angela began, her voice steady despite the emotion she felt. "Today, we sent a message that prejudice and abuse of power will not go unchallenged. But our work isn't done. This is just the beginning of a fight for real, lasting change." Her words were met with thunderous applause. Angela's courage and resilience had turned her into a symbol of hope and empowerment, inspiring others to stand up against injustice. The impact of the trial rippled far beyond Angela's case. The police department announced sweeping reforms, including mandatory bias training, stricter oversight, and the implementation of body cameras for all officers. Community leaders and activists continued to push for accountability, using Angela's story as a rallying point for change. Diana, too, became a sought-after advocate for civil rights, taking on cases that aimed to dismantle systemic racism. She often credited Angela's bravery for sparking a movement that extended beyond the courtroom. As for Angela, she returned to her work as a social worker, but her life had forever changed. She was invited to speak at conferences, schools, and rallies, sharing her story and encouraging others to fight for justice. While the experience had been harrowing, Angela found strength in the solidarity and support she received. In her quiet moments, Angela reflected on the journey. She thought about the pain, the fear, and the humiliation she had endured, but also the power of standing up for what was right. She knew her story was just one of many, but she hoped it would inspire others to fight back against injustice, no matter how daunting the challenge. The final chapter of Angela's story was one of resilience, hope, and the belief that change is possible when people come together to demand it. Her fight was a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, one voice can spark a movement, and one act of courage can lead to justice.